The sharp pain shot through my shoulder as David's fingers dug into my arm, his grip so tight I could feel his wedding ring pressing against my skin. We stood in the narrow hallway behind the church fellowship hall, the sounds of my sister's wedding reception drifting through the thin walls like a cruel reminder of what this day was supposed to be about. My lavender maid of honor dress, the one Amanda had specifically chosen because she said it brought out my eyes, now felt like a costume in a play I never auditioned for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You're embarrassing me, Jessica, David hissed through clenched teeth, his face so close to mine I could smell the whiskey on his breath. My mother specifically asked you to step back from this ridiculous maid of honor thing. Why can't you just be reasonable for once? The fluorescent lights above us flickered, casting harsh shadows across his face. And for a terrifying moment, I didn't recognize the man I'd married 2 years ago. This wasn't the David who used to bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings or the one who'd cried when I said yes to his proposal. This was someone else entirely, someone whose eyes held a coldness that made my stomach turn. "Let go of me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But his grip only tightened, and I knew that tomorrow I'd have bruises in the shape of his fingers, bruises I'd have to explain away to my third-grade students who noticed everything. To understand how I ended up in that hallway, fighting with my husband over something as simple as standing beside my sister on her wedding day, I need to take you back to where it all started. My name is Jessica Mitchell Thompson, though most people just call me Jess, and I've been teaching 3rd grade at Millfield Elementary for 6 years now. I'm 28, though my students always guess I'm younger because I still get excited about things like butterfly gardens and science experiments that make volcanoes erupt in tiny classroom demonstrations. I've always been the peacekeeper in my family, the one who smooths over arguments and finds compromises when tensions run high. My mother Carol used to joke that I could mediate a dispute between cats and dogs if given enough time and patience. Maybe that's why I became a teacher. Or maybe it's just who I've always been, the person who believes that most problems can be solved with kindness and understanding. Millfield, Texas, isn't a big place by any stretch of the imagination. With just over 25,000 people, it's the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, where your business becomes everyone's business, whether you want it to or not, and where family reputations follow you from cradle to grave. It sits about 40 minutes outside Austin, close enough that you can drive in for a concert or dinner, but far enough away that it maintains that small-town feel where the high school football games still draw half the population on Friday nights. I grew up in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street with my younger sister Amanda and our mother Carol, after our father decided when I was 12 that family life wasn't for him anymore. Mom worked double shifts at Millfield General Hospital to keep us afloat, first as a nurse's aide, and eventually working her way up to a supervisor position in the cardiac unit. She taught us early that hard work and integrity matter more than the size of your house or the brand of your clothes. Amanda, who everyone calls Mandy, is 3 years younger than me and has always been the artistic rebel of our family. Where I chose the safe path of education and stability, she followed her passion for graphic design, building a freelance business that lets her work with musicians and small businesses who appreciate her vintage-inspired aesthetic. She's the one who remembers to wear mismatched earrings just because they make her happy, who paints her nails different colors, and who never met a thrift store she didn't love. We've always been close, Mandy and I, probably because we only had each other and Mom for so long. When other kids had 2 parents shuttling them to soccer practice and dance recitals, we had each other, walking home from school together, helping each other with homework at the kitchen table, while Mom caught a few hours of sleep between shifts. There is a bond between us that goes deeper than just sisterhood, forged in those years when we learned that family is what you make it, not what society tells you it should look like. I met David Thompson on a rainy Thursday evening in March, 3 years ago, at a fundraiser for the local animal shelter where I volunteer on weekends. The event was held at the Millfield Country Club, and I almost hadn't gone because I felt out of place in my one good dress among all the designer outfits and expensive jewelry. But Sophie Chen, my best friend since college, had insisted I needed to get out more, and the cause was important to me. David was standing by the silent auction table, looking polished and confident in his navy suit, examining a photography package donated by one of the local studios. He had this easy smile and warm brown eyes that made me forget about feeling underdressed. When he introduced himself, his handshake was firm but not aggressive, and he genuinely seemed interested when I told him about my work at the elementary school. "A teacher," he'd said, and his smile had widened. "That's incredible. I can't imagine having the patience for that, but it's so important, what you do. Shaping young minds and all that." We talked for over an hour that night, standing beside the auction table as the crowd swirled around us. He told me about his work selling insurance, how he was working his way up to partner at his firm, and his plans to eventually start his own agency. He asked thoughtful questions about my students, about the challenges facing public education, about my volunteer work at the animal shelter. By the time the evening ended, I found myself genuinely looking forward to the dinner date he'd asked me on. Our early relationship felt like something out of a romantic movie. David would surprise me with coffee from my favorite shop on difficult Monday mornings, leave little notes in my car when he knew I was having a rough week with particularly challenging students, and listen patiently when I needed to vent about budget cuts or administrative frustrations. He seemed genuinely interested in my world, even visiting my classroom during the school's open house and charming my students with his easy manner and willingness to participate in their science demonstrations. The Thompson family was a different story entirely. David's parents, Linda and Robert Thompson, lived in Millfield's most exclusive gated community, Prestige Estates, in a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread rather than a place where real people lived their daily lives. Linda sold luxury real estate and had that polished, never a hair out of place appearance that made me acutely aware of my Target wardrobe and drugstore makeup. Robert worked as a senior manager at Millfield First National Bank, the kind of position that came with automatic respect in a town where family names and professional standings mattered. My first dinner at the Thompson house happened about 6 weeks into my relationship with David, and I spent 3 hours getting ready, changing outfits 4 times before settling on a conservative black dress that I hoped struck the right balance between respectful and stylish. The house itself intimidated me with its soaring ceilings, marble countertops, and artwork that looked expensive enough to pay my rent for 6 months. Linda greeted me at the door with a smile that seemed genuine enough, though I caught her eyes doing a quick assessment of my outfit and shoes. "Jessica, so lovely to finally meet you. David's told us so much about his teacher friend." The way she said teacher friend made it sound like a hobby rather than a profession, but I pushed the feeling aside, determined to make a good impression. Robert was warmer, asking about my work at the Peanut School, and seeming genuinely interested in my answers, though I noticed he kept deferring to Linda whenever the conversation touched on anything more personal. David's younger sister Rachel was home from law school that weekend, and she had that same polished confidence as her mother, though tempered with the kind of sharp intelligence that made me immediately like her. She asked smart questions about education policy and seemed genuinely curious about my perspective as someone working in the system, rather than just reading about it in newspapers. The dinner itself went smoothly enough, though I found myself being more careful with my words than usual, second-guessing casual comments that would have been perfectly normal at my own family's table. When Linda asked about my family, I gave a careful version of our story, emphasizing Mom's work at the hospital and Mandy's growing design business while downplaying the financial struggles in our father's absence. "How interesting," Linda had said when I mentioned Mom's job. "Healthcare is such important work. And your sister, the artist, how creative. David's always been more practical, haven't you, honey? He's got such good business sense." There was something in her tone that made me feel like my family was being evaluated and found somehow lacking, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what she'd said that bothered me. David squeezed my hand under the table and gave me an encouraging smile, and I decided I was probably being oversensitive. As our relationship deepened over the following months, I began to notice small things that hadn't been apparent during those early, exciting weeks. David had opinions about my clothes, not demanding exactly, but suggestions delivered with such confidence that I found myself gradually shifting my wardrobe toward pieces he preferred. When I mentioned wanting to sign up for a photography class at the community college, something I'd been interested in for years, he gently discouraged it. "You're already so busy with school and the animal shelter," he'd said, running his fingers through my hair as we watched television on his couch. "And isn't photography kind of expensive? All that equipment and everything. Maybe wait until you're more settled financially. The comment stung because my finances were actually fine. I'd been saving money specifically for the class, but he'd made it sound like a frivolous expense rather than something that might bring me joy. I let the registration deadline pass, telling myself he was probably right about being too busy. When David proposed 14 months after we met, it was everything I thought I wanted. He'd planned an elaborate surprise at the same country club where we'd first met, arranging for the evening to end with him on one knee beside the fountain in the garden, fairy lights twinkling overhead like something out of a fairy tale. The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire that caught the light perfectly, and when he asked me to be his wife, my heart felt so full I could barely speak. "I love you, Jessica Mitchell," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to build a life with you, a real life with a beautiful home and a future that makes both our families proud." I said yes, of course I said yes, because I loved him and because the future he described sounded wonderful. But even in that perfect moment, something about the way he'd phrased it, making both our families proud, left me with a tiny knot of uncertainty that I couldn't quite name. The engagement period should have been the happiest time of my life, and in many ways it was. David was attentive and romantic, surprising me with weekend trips to nearby bed and breakfasts, involving me in decisions about our future home, talking excitedly about the wedding and the life we'd build together. But as the months passed, I began to notice a subtle shift in our dynamic. It started with small things. David would make comments about my hair being prettier when it was straight, rather than in the natural waves I preferred. He'd suggest restaurants for our dates, rather than asking what I was in the mood for. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And when I'd offer alternative suggestions, he'd explain why his choice was better, more convenient, had superior service or food quality. Gradually, I found myself going along with his preferences, because it was easier than having discussions that felt more like debates. The shift was so gradual that I didn't really notice it happening until Sophie pointed it out during one of our regular coffee dates at Brew & Books, the little coffee shop downtown where we'd been meeting since college. "You're different lately," she'd said, studying my face over her latte. Sophie had known me since freshman year at University of Texas, and she had a way of seeing through the polite facades I sometimes constructed. "More careful, I guess. Like you're editing yourself." "What do you mean?" I'd asked, though something in my chest tightened because I suspected I knew exactly what she meant. "Remember when you used to get excited about things? Like, genuinely enthusiastic about random stuff, like that photography class you wanted to take, or trying new restaurants, or even just picking where we'd meet for coffee? Now you always defer to David's opinions, even when he's not here." I'd laughed it off, told her she was imagining things, that I was just learning to compromise the way you do in a serious relationship. But her words stayed with me, and I found myself paying more attention to my own behavior, noticing how often I'd start to express an opinion, and then modify it mid-sentence to something I thought David would approve of. The wedding planning process brought these dynamics into sharper focus. Linda Thompson had opinions about everything, from the venue to the flowers to the guest list, and she expressed them with the kind of authority that made disagreement feel almost rude. When I mentioned that Mandy and I had always dreamed of having our weddings at the historic downtown event hall where our parents had gotten married, Linda had gently but firmly steered us toward the country club. "The Millfield Country Club has such a lovely reputation," she'd said during one of our planning meetings. "And the catering is exceptional. That downtown place is charming, I'm sure, but for a wedding of this caliber, you really want something that reflects the quality of the families involved." David had nodded along with his mother's reasoning, and when I'd tried to explain the sentimental value of the downtown venue, he'd squeezed my hand and said we could visit both places before making a final decision. But somehow we never quite got around to visiting the downtown hall, and the deposit was placed at the country club before I'd even realized the decision had been made. The same pattern played out with dozens of smaller decisions. My preference for wildflower arrangements was overruled in favor of more formal roses and lilies. The band I'd found, a local group that played a fun mix of country and classic rock, was replaced with a more traditional ensemble that specialized in what Linda called appropriate reception music. Even the menu shifted from the comfort food style I'd initially requested to a more upscale selection that fit the country club's image. Each individual change seemed reasonable when David and Linda explained their reasoning. The formal flowers would photograph better and last longer in the heat. The traditional band had more experience with wedding receptions and could be counted on to keep the celebration moving smoothly. The upscale menu would impress our guests and reflect the quality of the event we were hosting. But taken together, these changes meant that our wedding was becoming something I barely recognized, something that felt more like a Thompson family event that I happened to be attending, rather than a celebration of David's and my commitment to each other. When I tried to voice these concerns to David, he assured me that the details didn't matter as much as the fact that we'd be married at the end of the day. "I just want everything to be perfect for you," he'd say, pulling me close and kissing my forehead. "My mom has experience with these things, and she wants this to be special. For both of us. We can have all our casual parties and gatherings after we're married. This one day should be something memorable." I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his motivations were pure and loving. But there was something about the way these conversations always ended, with me giving in, with my preferences being gently but systematically overruled, that left me feeling increasingly disconnected from what was supposed to be one of the most important days of my life. The final straw came 6 weeks before the wedding, during what was supposed to be a casual family dinner at the Thompson house. David and I had been discussing the ceremony details, specifically the wedding party, when Linda had made a suggestion that left me speechless. "I've been thinking about the wedding party arrangement," she'd said, refilling her wine glass with the kind of casual confidence that made her words sound like simple observations rather than major requests. "And I wonder if it might be more appropriate for Rachel to serve as David's best person rather than having a traditional setup. It would be so lovely to have the siblings supporting each other, and Rachel has such poise and presence." I'd looked at David, expecting him to explain that we'd already chosen our wedding party, that I'd asked my sister Mandy to be my maid of honor, and he'd asked his college roommate Marcus to be his best man. But instead of the quick correction I'd anticipated, David had looked thoughtful. "That's an interesting idea, Mom," he'd said slowly. "It would be pretty unique to have Rachel stand up there with me." "But what about Mandy?" I'd asked, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. "She's already planning the bachelorette party. And we've been talking about this since we were kids." Linda had smiled at me with the kind of patient expression usually reserved for children who don't understand complex adult concepts. Of course, Amanda would still be part of the celebration, just perhaps in a different capacity. She could do a reading or handle the guest book, something meaningful but less prominent. The casualness with which she'd suggested demoting my sister, my best friend, my closest family member, to a minor role in my own wedding left me feeling like I'd been slapped. This wasn't about logistics or appropriateness or creating a better ceremony. This was about control, about ensuring that the Thompson family maintained prominence even in a celebration that was supposed to be about David and me joining our families together. I'd looked around the table, waiting for David to object, to explain that the wedding party had already been decided, and that changing it now would be hurtful and unnecessary. Instead, he'd been nodding slowly, as if his mother's suggestion was not only reasonable but obviously superior to our original plan. "We could think about it," he'd said, reaching for my hand across the table. "Mom's right that it would be unique to have our siblings standing up with us. But I didn't want unique. I wanted my sister beside me on the most important day of my life, just like we'd dreamed about since we were little girls playing wedding with our dolls. I wanted the person who knew me best, who'd been there through every major moment of my life, who understood without explanation why certain things mattered to me. "I think I need some air," I'd managed to say, excusing myself from the table and stepping out onto the Thompsons' perfectly manicured back patio. The evening air was warm and humid, typical for Texas in late spring, and I stood there looking out at their pristine pool and landscape lighting, trying to figure out how a simple family dinner had turned into another situation where my wishes were being politely but firmly overruled. Through the sliding glass doors, I could hear the continued conversation, Linda's voice explaining something to David in tones too low for me to make out the words. When David finally joined me outside, he'd wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder. "Hey," he'd said softly. "You okay out here? I want Mandy as my maid of honor, I'd said without turning around. This isn't negotiable, David. She's my sister, and this is important to me. I'd felt him tense slightly behind me, though his voice remained gentle when he responded. Of course she's important to you. No one's saying she isn't. Mom was just suggesting we think about doing something a little different, maybe more balanced between our families. More balanced? I turned in his arms to face him. How is it balanced to have your sister in the primary wedding party role while mine gets moved to some lesser position? That's not balance, that's replacement. David had sighed, and for the first time I'd seen a flash of something like impatience cross his face before he'd schooled his expression back to understanding concern. Jessica, I love that you're close to your sister. It's one of the things I admire about you. But this is about more than just family feelings. This is about how things look, about what makes sense for the kind of wedding we're having. The phrase, the kind of wedding we're having, had hit me like a physical blow, because I'd realized in that moment that somewhere along the way, it had stopped being our wedding and had become their wedding, the Thompson family wedding that I was being allowed to participate in if I followed their rules and accepted their decisions. What if I don't want that kind of wedding? I'd asked, my voice barely above a whisper. David's expression had softened, and he'd cupped my face in his hands with the tender gesture that had always melted my resistance in the past. Baby, I know this is all overwhelming. Wedding planning is stressful for everyone. But we're almost at the finish line, and then we'll be married, and all these details won't matter anymore. I just want you to be happy. But standing there in his arms, surrounded by the perfection of his family's world, I'd realized that being happy seemed to require me to give up the things that mattered most to me, one small compromise at a time, until I was in danger of disappearing entirely into the life someone else had planned for me. I'd agreed to think about the wedding party suggestion, mostly because I was too emotionally exhausted to continue the conversation. But as David drove me home that night, chattering about other wedding details and seemingly oblivious to my silence, I'd made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was going to talk to Mandy about everything, really talk to her, and then I was going to figure out how to take back some control over my own wedding. Because if I couldn't stand up for myself and the people I loved during one of the most important events of my life, what did that say about the marriage I was about to enter? The Thompson family's influence had grown so gradually and seemed so reasonable at each step that I'd almost missed how completely it had taken over. But sitting in David's car as he drove through the familiar streets of Millfield, I'd felt something inside me shift, a quiet but determined resolve that had been building through months of gentle but persistent erosion of my preferences and choices. Tomorrow, I'd thought, I would start fighting back. The conversation with Mandy happened the next evening at our childhood home on Maple Street, in the same kitchen where we'd done homework together while Mom worked her double shifts. I'd called her that morning, asking if she could come over after work, and something in my voice must have alerted her because she'd arrived with a bottle of wine and her serious expression, the one she wore when she knew important conversations were coming. Mom was pulling an evening shift at the hospital, so we had the house to ourselves. Mandy sat across from me at the old oak table that had been our family's gathering place for as long as I could remember, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing one of her vintage band t-shirts and the mismatched earrings that always made me smile. She looked so much like herself, so authentically Mandy, that I felt a sharp pang of loss for the person I used to be before I'd started editing myself to fit into David's world. "Okay, Spill," she said, pouring wine into the 2 glasses I'd set out. "You sounded weird on the phone, and you've got that look." "What look?" I asked, though I was already reaching for my wine, needing the courage it might provide. "The look you get when you're trying to convince yourself that everything's fine when it's obviously not. I've seen that look a lot lately, actually." She studied my face with the kind of attention that came from growing up together, from knowing each other's expressions better than our own. "This is about David's family, isn't it?" I told her everything. About the gradual shift in wedding planning decisions. About Linda's constant suggestions that somehow always became final choices. About David's increasing deference to his mother's opinions over mine. I told her about the venue change, the flowers, the band, all the small compromises that had added up to something that barely resembled the wedding we'd originally planned together. When I got to Linda's suggestion about replacing her as maid of honor with Rachel, Mandy's face went through a series of expressions, starting with disbelief and ending with something that looked dangerously close to rage. She wants to what? Mandy set down her wine glass with enough force that some of the liquid sloshed over the rim. She wants to kick me out of your wedding party so David's sister can stand up there instead. Not kick you out exactly? I said, though even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. She suggested you could do a reading or handle the guest book or something. A reading? Mandy's voice rose to a pitch I hadn't heard since we were teenagers fighting over clothes. Jess, we've been planning this since we were kids. We used to practice walking down the aisle in Mom's old nightgowns, remember? You promised me I'd be your maid of honor when you got married, and I promised you the same thing. The memory hit me like a physical blow. We had done that, spent countless afternoons playing wedding with whatever we could find in Mom's closet, taking turns being the bride while the other served as maid of honor. We'd made those promises to each other when I was 10 and she was 7, sitting on the floor of our shared bedroom, completely serious, despite the ridiculous makeshift veils we'd constructed from old curtains. I know, I said, my voice catching slightly. I told David that wasn't happening. I was clear about it. And what did he say? I hesitated, because David's response hadn't been the immediate support I'd expected and needed. He said we'd talk about it, that maybe his mom had a point about family balance. Mandy stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see her processing not just my words but everything I wasn't saying, all the subtle ways I'd been diminished over the past months without even realizing it was happening. Jess, she said finally, her voice gentler than it had been moments before. Do you want to marry this guy? The question caught me off guard, because of course I wanted to marry David. I loved him, we'd built a life together, we had plans for the future. But as I opened my mouth to give her the automatic reassurance she was expecting, I found myself pausing, really thinking about her question, instead of just reacting to it. I love him, I said finally. That's not what I asked. Mandy leaned forward, reaching across the table to cover my hand with hers. I asked if you want to marry him. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're about to marry into a family that's already decided who you should be, and that person isn't you. Her words hung in the air between us, putting into stark terms what I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. I thought about the woman I'd been before David, the one who'd gotten excited about trying new restaurants and taking photography classes, who'd had opinions about movies and music and weekend plans. When was the last time I'd expressed enthusiasm about something that didn't align with David's preferences? It's not that simple, I said, though I was beginning to suspect it might be exactly that simple. Relationships require compromise. You give up some things to build something together. Some things, sure, but not everything that makes you who you are. Mandy squeezed my hand. And definitely not your family. I'm your sister, Jess. I've been your sister a hell of a lot longer than he's been your boyfriend. And I'll be your sister long after he's gone if things don't work out. The casual way she mentioned the possibility of things not working out with David should have offended me, should have made me defensive on his behalf. Instead, it felt like she'd given voice to a fear I'd been carrying without acknowledging, the growing worry that the man I was marrying wasn't the same person I'd fallen in love with. Or maybe that I wasn't the same person he'd fallen in love with. What am I supposed to do? I asked, hating how lost I sounded. The wedding's in 6 weeks. Everything's planned, deposits are paid, people have made travel arrangements. You're supposed to fight for what matters to you, Mandy said firmly. Starting with me standing beside you on your wedding day, because that matters to both of us, and it should matter to David if he really loves you. We talked until almost midnight, working our way through the bottle of wine and most of a bag of the chocolate chip cookies Mom kept stocked in the pantry for her daughter's emergency visits. By the time Mandy left, we'd developed what she called our battle plan, though I preferred to think of it as a strategy for having productive conversations about my concerns. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. I would have a serious conversation with David about the maid of honor situation, making it clear that this wasn't negotiable. If he pushed back, or tried to convince me to compromise, I would hold firm. If Linda continued to pressure us to change the wedding party, I would address it directly with her rather than hoping David would handle it. "You're allowed to have non-negotiables," Mandy had said as she gathered her purse and jacket. "Everyone has things that are too important to compromise on. Your sister being your maid of honor should be one of those things." I'd agreed, feeling more confident than I had in months. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to discover just how much control I'd actually given up, and how difficult it was going to be to take it back. The opportunity for that serious conversation with David came sooner than I'd expected. He called the next morning while I was getting ready for school, asking if I wanted to have dinner at his apartment that evening so we could go over some final wedding details. His tone was casual, but something about the timing made me suspect he'd been thinking about our previous evening's conversation as much as I had. David's apartment was in one of Millfield's newer complexes, all granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, the kind of place that looked impressive, but never quite felt like home to me. He'd already started moving some of his things to the house we'd bought together, but this space still reflected his single life, all clean lines and expensive electronics with very little personality. He'd ordered takeout from the upscale Italian place downtown, the one with cloth napkins and wine lists that made me feel like I should dress up just to eat there. The gesture was thoughtful, but it also felt like preparation for a conversation he expected to be difficult. The kind of evening where you soften someone up with their favorite food before delivering news they won't want to hear. "So," he said as we settled on his couch with plates of chicken marsala and glasses of wine, "I talked to my mom today about the wedding party situation." My stomach clenched immediately. I'd planned to bring up the subject myself, to take control of the conversation from the beginning. But David had beaten me to it, and his phrasing suggested that decisions had already been made without my input. "What did you talk about?" I asked, setting down my fork because I'd suddenly lost my appetite. "She feels really bad about upsetting you last night," he said, reaching over to squeeze my knee. "That wasn't her intention at all. She was just trying to think of ways to make the ceremony more meaningful for both our families." The way he'd positioned Linda as the injured party, someone who needed defending rather than someone who'd overstepped boundaries, immediately put me on edge. This wasn't starting as the conversation I'd planned to have, where I'd calmly explain my position, and he'd understand why his mother's suggestion was inappropriate. "David, I need to be clear about something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mandy is going to be my maid of honor. That's not changing. It's not up for discussion or negotiation." He nodded, but his expression was carefully neutral in a way that made me suspicious. "Of course Amanda is important to you. No one's questioning that." "Then why are we having this conversation?" David sighed, setting down his own plate and turning to face me fully on the couch. "Because my mom made a good point about appearances, about how things look to our guests. Rachel just graduated from law school, she's accomplished and poised, and she knows how to handle herself in formal situations." The implication hung heavy in the air between us. Rachel was accomplished and poised, unlike my sister with her vintage clothes and artistic career. Rachel knew how to handle formal situations, unlike Mandy, who might embarrass us somehow with her authenticity and refusal to conform to other people's expectations. "What exactly are you saying about my sister?" I asked, my voice colder than I'd intended. "I'm not saying anything bad about Amanda," David said quickly, though his defensive tone suggested he knew exactly how his words had sounded. "She's great, she's creative and fun, and she'll always be part of our family. But this is a formal wedding, Jess. We're having it at the country club. There will be important people there, people who matter for my career, and my parents' standing in the community." "People who matter for your career," I repeated slowly. "Are you saying my sister doesn't matter?" "That's not what I said." David's voice was getting tighter, the patient understanding he'd started with giving way to frustration. "I'm saying that sometimes we have to make choices based on more than just personal feelings. Sometimes we have to think about the bigger picture." The bigger picture. David's bigger picture, which apparently didn't include room for my family to be themselves, for my sister to stand beside me on my wedding day simply because she was my sister and I loved her. I thought about Mandy's question from the night before, about whether I wanted to marry this man, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "The bigger picture for me includes my sister as my maid of honor," I said firmly. "If your bigger picture doesn't have room for that, then maybe we need to reconsider what kind of wedding we're having." David's expression shifted then, the careful patience finally giving way to something harder, more controlling. Jessica, be reasonable. This isn't just about you anymore. When you marry me, you're joining my family, and that comes with certain expectations and responsibilities. Such as? Such as understanding that sometimes family harmony requires small sacrifices. Such as recognizing that my mother has experience with these events, and maybe knows better than we do what works and what doesn't. Small sacrifices. That phrase echoed in my head as I stared at the man I was supposed to marry in 6 weeks. When had my relationship with my sister become a small sacrifice? When had my own preferences and feelings become obstacles to family harmony rather than important considerations in planning my own wedding? What if I'm not willing to make that sacrifice? I asked. The question seemed to catch David off guard, as if the possibility of my refusing to compromise hadn't seriously occurred to him. For a moment, his composed facade slipped, and I saw something that looked almost like panic cross his features. "You can't be serious," he said finally. "You'd really jeopardize our entire wedding over something this trivial?" Trivial. My sister's role in my wedding was trivial to him, which meant my relationship with her was trivial, which meant the things that mattered most to me were trivial. I felt something break inside me, some last thread of hope that we could work this out through reasonable discussion. "My sister isn't trivial to me," I said, standing up from the couch because I suddenly couldn't bear to be sitting next to him anymore. "And if she's trivial to you, then maybe we have bigger problems than wedding planning." David stood as well, moving to block my path to the door. "Don't be dramatic, Jess. You know I care about your family. But this is one day, one ceremony, and there are lots of ways for Amanda to be involved without necessarily being the maid of honor. Name one reason why she shouldn't be my maid of honor, but isn't about impressing your mother or maintaining some image that has nothing to do with who we actually are." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, and in that moment of silence, I had my answer. There was no good reason, no legitimate concern about Mandy's ability to fulfill the role or support me on my wedding day. This was entirely about control, about ensuring that the Thompson family vision took precedence over everything else, including my relationship with my sister. "I'm going home," I said, reaching for my purse. "Jessica, wait." David caught my arm, not roughly but firmly enough to make me stop. "Don't leave like this, we can work this out." "How?" I asked, looking down at his hand on my arm. "How do we work this out when you think my feelings about my own sister are trivial and dramatic?" He released my arm immediately, his expression softening into the apologetic look that had worked so many times before when we'd had disagreements. "I didn't mean it like that. I'm just stressed about everything, and my mom has been in my ear all day about this." Maybe I'm not explaining it right. Part of me wanted to accept the apology, to let him explain it differently, to find some middle ground that would avoid the confrontation that was building between us. But Mandy's words from the night before kept echoing in my mind, about fighting for what mattered to me, about refusing to give up everything that made me who I was. "Then explain it right," I said. "Explain to me why your mother's opinion about my wedding party matters more than mine." David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd learned to recognize as a sign that he was struggling to find the right words to get what he wanted without looking unreasonable. "It's not that her opinion matters more, it's that she has experience with these things, and she's trying to help us avoid potential problems." "What problems?" "Social problems," he said finally, and I could tell the honesty was costing him. "People talking, people judging our choices, people thinking we don't understand how to handle formal events properly." There it was, the truth beneath all the gentle suggestions and reasonable explanations. This was about social status, about maintaining the Thompson family's reputation for doing things the right way, about ensuring that nothing about our wedding gave anyone in their social circle reason to look down on us. "People like who?" I asked. "People like the Hendersons, whose daughter just got married last month with this elaborate wedding that everyone's still talking about. People like my dad's business partners, who notice these things. People like the other attorneys Rachel will be working with at her new firm." Each example felt like another weight added to a scale that was already tipping away from me and toward the life the Thompson family had planned for us. Our wedding wasn't about David and me anymore, it was about maintaining their social standing and ensuring that nothing we did reflected poorly on their family name. "What about my mom?" I asked. What about my friends from school? What about the people who actually know us and care about us, rather than judging us based on whether we picked the right flowers or hired the right band? Those people matter too, David said, but his tone suggested they mattered significantly less than the others he'd mentioned. But, Jess, my family has worked really hard to build their reputation in this community. They've earned respect through years of making good choices and presenting themselves well. When you marry me, you benefit from that reputation, but you also have a responsibility to maintain it. The word responsibility hit me like a slap. I had a responsibility to maintain the Thompson family reputation, but apparently David had no corresponding responsibility to defend my choices or support my relationship with my sister. The obligations in this marriage seem to flow in only one direction. And if I'm not willing to accept that responsibility? I asked. David's face went very still, and for a moment I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before, something cold and calculating that made my stomach clench with sudden fear. Then maybe you're not ready to be married, he said quietly. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Comply with his family's expectations or lose him entirely. Choose their version of respectability or face the consequences of disrupting a wedding that was 6 weeks away. With deposits paid and guests invited, and a future planned around the assumption that I would ultimately give in. Maybe I'm not, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was shaking. David's confident expression faltered. He'd expected his ultimatum to bring me back in line, to make me realize how much I had to lose if I continued to resist. He hadn't expected me to call his bluff. You don't mean that, he said, reaching for me again. Don't I? I stepped back, putting space between us. Because it seems like the person you want to marry is someone who puts your family's social standing ahead of her own family relationships. Someone who smiles and nods and makes choices based on what other people will think, rather than what actually matters to her. If that's who you want to marry, then you're right, I'm not ready. I left his apartment that night without another word, driving home through the familiar streets of Millfield, with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and my mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. I'd drawn a line in the sand, made it clear that some things were non-negotiable, and David had responded by essentially threatening to call off our engagement. The house on Maple Street was dark when I arrived, Mom still at work for another few hours. I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the ribbons and medals from high school achievements, the photos of Mandy and me growing up together, the books I'd loved and the art I'd created before I'd started editing myself to fit someone else's expectations. My phone buzzed with text messages from David throughout the evening, each one a variation on the same theme. He hadn't meant to upset me. We could figure this out. Maybe he could talk to his mother about compromising. Maybe there was a way to include both Rachel and Amanda in prominent roles. But I noticed he never said the words I needed to hear. That Amanda would be my maid of honor as originally planned, that his mother's opinion didn't override mine, that he would stand up to his family's expectations when they conflicted with my needs and feelings. The next few days passed in a strange, tense limbo. David continued trying to reach me, showing up at the school during my lunch break with flowers and apologies, calling in the evenings with new suggestions for how we might restructure the wedding party to make everyone happy. But each conversation only reinforced my growing realization that he fundamentally didn't understand why this mattered to me, or perhaps didn't care enough to make it matter to him. Linda called me directly on Thursday afternoon, her voice warm and concerned as she invited me to lunch so we could clear the air about the wedding party situation. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at the country club restaurant, telling myself that maybe a direct conversation would help her understand my position. The country club dining room was exactly what I'd expected. All white tablecloths and crystal glasses, filled with women who looked like variations of Linda herself, perfectly dressed and discussing charity events and social obligations over expensive salads. I felt conspicuously out of place in my teaching clothes, a simple blouse and cardigan that suddenly seemed shabby in this environment. Linda was already seated when I arrived, wearing a silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary and greeting me with a smile that seemed genuine enough. She'd ordered sparkling water for both of us and had clearly chosen a table in a quiet corner where our conversation wouldn't be overheard. "Jessica, thank you so much for coming," she said as I settled into the chair across from her. "I've been so worried that you've gotten the wrong impression about my suggestions for the wedding party." Her tone was warm and concerned, the voice of a woman who genuinely cared about my feelings and wanted to resolve any misunderstandings. But something about the careful staging of this lunch, the neutral location and the private table, made me suspect this was as calculated as everything else Linda did. "I appreciate you wanting to talk," I said carefully. "I think there may have been some confusion about my feelings regarding the maid of honor position." Linda nodded sympathetically. "Oh, I completely understand your attachment to Amanda. She's your sister, of course you want her involved in your special day. That's exactly why I thought it would be wonderful to give her a more meaningful role than just standing there during the ceremony." The way she phrased it, as if being maid of honor was somehow less meaningful than whatever alternative role she had in mind, immediately put me on guard. This wasn't going to be the straightforward conversation I'd hoped for. "The maid of honor position is meaningful to me," I said. "Mandy and I have planned for this since we were children." "Of course, and that's sweet," Linda said, her smile never wavering. "But you're not children anymore, are you? You're planning a sophisticated event that will be attended by some very important people in our community. David's career depends on making good impressions, and as his wife, your choices reflect on him as well." There it was again, the suggestion that my personal feelings were somehow childish compared to the adult concerns of social standing and professional advancement. I thought about all the times over the past months when my preferences had been gently but firmly redirected toward choices that better reflected the Thompson family's standards. "What exactly are you worried Amanda might do?" I asked directly. Linda looked momentarily taken aback by the bluntness of my question, but she recovered quickly. "It's not about what Amanda might do, dear. It's about what works best for the overall tone and presentation of the event. But you must have specific concerns, or you wouldn't be suggesting this change." For the first time since I'd known her, Linda seemed to struggle for the right words, and I realized that her objections to Mandy were probably based on nothing more substantial than the fact that my sister didn't fit the image she wanted to project. "Amanda is lovely," Linda said finally, "but she's very artistic, free-spirited. Sometimes people like that can be unpredictable in formal settings." "Unpredictable how?" "Well, you never know what they might say or do. They don't always understand the importance of maintaining proper decorum." I stared at her across the pristine white tablecloth, understanding finally that this conversation was never going to be about Mandy's qualifications or ability to fulfill the role of maid of honor. This was about Linda's prejudices against people who didn't conform to her narrow vision of respectability, about her assumption that someone who wore vintage clothes and chose an artistic career couldn't be trusted to behave appropriately at an upscale wedding. "My sister is one of the most responsible, caring people I know," I said, keeping my voice level with effort. "She's never done anything to suggest she wouldn't handle any situation with grace and dignity." "I'm sure she's wonderful in her own way," Linda said, and the condescension in her tone made my hands clench in my lap. "But Rachel has experience with formal events. She grew up attending these kinds of functions. She knows the protocols and expectations. She would ensure that everything runs smoothly." "And Amanda wouldn't?" "Amanda might try her best, but she lacks the background and experience that really matter in these situations." The classism underlying Linda's objections was so blatant that I found myself temporarily speechless. Mandy lacked the right background, the right experience, the right breeding to stand beside me at my own wedding. Never mind that she was my sister, that she loved me, that she'd been supporting me and celebrating with me through every important moment of my life. According to Linda, none of that mattered as much as having the right social pedigree. "I see," I said finally. Linda must have mistaken my quiet tone for agreement, because her smile brightened. "I knew you'd understand once we had a chance to talk about it properly. David was so worried that you'd be upset, but I told him that you're a sensible girl who wants what's best for your marriage." "A sensible girl who wants what's best for your marriage. Not what's best for me. Not what would make me happiest on my wedding day, but what's best for my marriage as defined by the Thompson family's standards and expectations." "What if what's best for my marriage is having my sister as my maid of honor?" I asked. Linda's smile became strained. "Well, that's a lovely sentiment, Jessica, but marriage requires compromise. It requires putting the good of the family unit ahead of individual desires. My sister is my family too." Of course she is, dear. But she's your family of origin, not your family of choice. When you marry David, the Thompson family becomes your primary family, and their needs and expectations should take precedence. The casual way she dismissed my relationship with Mandy, reducing it to something from my past that should give way to my future obligations, made me feel physically sick. This wasn't about wedding party logistics or social protocols. This was about erasing my identity, my history, my most important relationships in service of becoming the daughter-in-law Linda wanted. I need to think about all of this, I said, reaching for my purse. Of course, take your time, Linda said graciously. But do keep in mind that we're running out of time to make changes. If we're going to adjust the wedding party, we need to finalize those decisions soon, so we can update the programs and inform the photographer. The implication was clear. Decide quickly, and decide the way we want you to, or face the consequences of disrupting carefully laid plans with only weeks to spare. It was the same pressure tactics that had been applied to every other aspect of the wedding planning. The gentle but persistent push toward compliance, disguised as practical concerns about timing and logistics. I left the country club that afternoon feeling more certain than ever that Mandy had been right about fighting for what mattered to me. But I also felt the full weight of what that fight would entail, the social and family pressure that would be brought to bear if I continued to resist the Thompson family's vision for my wedding and my marriage. That evening I called Sophie and asked if she wanted to meet for coffee. I needed to talk to someone who'd known me before David. Someone who could remind me of who I used to be before I'd started second-guessing every preference and opinion I had. You look terrible, Sophie said bluntly when she arrived at Brew and Books, sliding into the chair across from me with her usual direct honesty. What did the Thompson family do now? I told her about the lunch with Linda, about the not-so-subtle pressure to replace Mandy with Rachel, about David's ultimatum that I needed to be ready for marriage, if I wanted this relationship to continue. Sophie listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail I shared. Jesus, Jess, she said when I finished. Do you hear yourself? Do you hear how crazy this all sounds? It's not crazy, I said automatically, then caught myself. Is it? A family trying to control who stands beside you at your own wedding. A fiancé who threatens to call off the engagement because you won't comply with his mother's social preferences? Yeah, that's pretty fucking crazy. Sophie had never been one to mince words, and her bluntness was exactly what I needed to cut through the careful rationalizations and gentle manipulations I'd been subjected to for months. But maybe they have a point about maintaining family harmony, I said, though even as I said it I knew how weak it sounded. Marriage is about compromise. Compromise goes both ways, Sophie said firmly. What are they compromising on? What are David and his family giving up to make you happy? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I couldn't think of a single example. Every compromise had flowed in one direction, every adjustment had been made to accommodate the Thompson family's preferences, while mine were gradually set aside as impractical or inappropriate. Maybe I'm being too stubborn about this, I said. Or maybe you're finally standing up for yourself after months of being slowly erased, Sophie countered. When was the last time you got excited about something? When was the last time you made a decision based on what you wanted, instead of what David's family would approve of? The questions hit harder than I'd expected because I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely enthusiastic about anything related to my wedding or my future. Everything had become filtered through the lens of Thompson family expectations, measured against standards that had nothing to do with my own values or desires. I love him, I said, the same response I'd given Mandy. I know you do. But does he love you, or does he love the version of you that fits into his family's plans? It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one that cut to the heart of everything that had been building over the past months. Did David love me for who I was, or for who I could become if I continued to reshape myself according to his family's expectations? I don't know anymore, I admitted, and saying the words out loud felt like stepping off a cliff. Sophie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Then maybe it's time to find out. The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the wedding, in the most ordinary way possible. I was grading math tests at my desk during my planning period when my phone rang with a call from an unknown local number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Miss Mitchell? This is Jennifer from Blooming Memories Florist. I'm calling because we received some conflicting information about your wedding order, and I wanted to clarify before we proceed. I set down my red pen, confused. Conflicting information about what? Well, we have your original order for the wildflower arrangements you selected. But yesterday we received a call from someone claiming to be you, requesting a complete change to white roses and lilies. The caller provided your wedding date and venue, but when I asked for the password we established for your account, she couldn't provide it. My blood went cold. Someone called pretending to be me? Yes, and when I explained that all changes needed to come directly from you with the account password, she became quite insistent. She said there had been a family emergency that required the change, and that she was calling on your behalf as your future mother-in-law, Linda. Linda had called my florist pretending to be me, trying to override the one floral choice I'd managed to maintain throughout all the wedding planning negotiations. The wildflowers had been my small victory, the single element of the wedding that still reflected my taste rather than the Thompson family's preferences. What exactly did she try to change? I asked, though I already suspected I knew. Everything, actually. She wanted to cancel your wildflower arrangements and replace them with traditional white roses and lilies for all the bouquets, centerpieces, and ceremony decorations. When I told her we couldn't make such extensive changes without direct authorization from you, she became quite upset and demanded to speak to the manager. Did you give her any information about my order? No, of course not. But Miss Mitchell, she seemed to know quite a bit about your wedding details already. She mentioned specific room layouts at your venue and timing for the ceremony that she wouldn't have known unless she'd been involved in the planning. After I hung up with Jennifer, promising to come in that afternoon to confirm my original order and add additional security measures to my account, I sat staring at my phone with shaking hands. This wasn't just about wedding party disagreements or social pressures anymore. Linda had crossed a line into outright deception, impersonating me to vendors, and attempting to make changes without my knowledge or consent. But what bothered me even more than Linda's actions was the question of whether David knew about them. Was this his mother acting independently, or was this part of a coordinated effort to override my choices when gentle persuasion failed? I couldn't concentrate on grading for the rest of the day. During lunch, I called 3 other vendors we'd hired for the wedding. The photographer reported no unusual contact, but the caterer had a different story. "Oh yes," Martha from Elegant Events Catering said when I asked if anyone other than David or I had contacted them recently. "Your mother-in-law called last week about adjusting the menu. She wanted to add some appetizers and upgrade the entree options. She said you'd approved the changes but asked her to handle the details since you were so busy with work." "What changes specifically?" "Well, she wanted to add oysters Rockefeller and beef tenderloin to replace the chicken and fish options you'd originally selected. It would increase your cost by about $800, but she said price wasn't a concern. $800. Added to our catering bill without my knowledge, for menu items I'd never discussed or approved. I thought about our carefully planned wedding budget, about the compromises David and I had made to afford the venue, and other expenses his family had insisted were necessary. "Did you make those changes?" I asked. I told her I'd need confirmation from you or David before adjusting the order. She seemed surprised that we couldn't make the changes based on her request alone, but she said she'd have David call to authorize them. David had never mentioned any call from the caterer or any discussion about menu changes. Either he'd forgotten to tell me about an $800 decision, or he'd deliberately chosen not to involve me in yet another aspect of our wedding planning. By the time school ended that afternoon, I had a growing list of vendors who'd been contacted by Linda, each time with changes that moved our wedding further away from the modest, personal celebration we'd originally planned and closer to the elaborate social event she envisioned. The wedding photographer had been asked about upgrading to additional coverage and formal portrait sessions. The music coordinator had received requests about changing our first dance song to something more traditional. Even our cake decorator had been contacted about replacing our simple 2-tier cake with a more elaborate 4-tier design. Each vendor had appropriately refused to make changes without direct authorization from David or me, but the scope of Linda's interference was staggering. She'd essentially been conducting a shadow wedding planning operation, attempting to override every choice that didn't meet her standards while keeping me unaware of what was happening. The most chilling discovery came when I stopped by the church where our ceremony was scheduled. Pastor Williams greeted me warmly, as he always did, but seemed surprised to see me. "Jessica, how wonderful to see you. I was just thinking I should call you about the ceremony details your future mother-in-law discussed with me." "What ceremony details?" Pastor Williams looked confused. "The changes to your vows. She stopped by yesterday and said you'd decided to use the traditional Episcopal vows instead of writing your own. She brought a copy of what you wanted included and asked me to prepare accordingly." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "She brought you vows?" "Yes. She said you'd been struggling with writing personal vows and had decided it would be more meaningful to use traditional promises that reflected your family's shared faith traditions." My mouth went dry. Linda hadn't just been interfering with flowers and catering and decorations. She'd been attempting to control the actual words David and I would speak to each other, the promises that would form the foundation of our marriage. "Pastor Williams, I never asked for any changes to our vows. David and I are planning to speak our own words to each other." The elderly minister's face fell. "Oh my. I was afraid something like this might happen. Your mother-in-law was quite insistent, but something about the situation felt off to me. The vows she brought seemed very formal, very traditional, but not particularly personal to either of you." "Do you still have them?" "Yes, she left them with me." He disappeared into his office and returned with several pages of printed text. I have to say, I was surprised by some of the language. I took the pages with trembling hands and began to read. The vows Linda had prepared were indeed traditional, but they were also deeply traditional in ways that made my stomach turn. The bride's promises included language about obedience, about deferring to her husband's judgment, about supporting his family's traditions and values above all else. The groom's vows were quite different, focused on protection and provision and leadership, with no corresponding promises about partnership or mutual respect. These weren't just traditional vows, they were vows that would legally and spiritually bind me to a marriage where my role was to submit and support, while David's role was to lead and decide. "This isn't what we want," I told Pastor Williams, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think so," he said gently. "That's why I hadn't prepared anything yet. I've been officiating weddings for 35 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right." I thanked Pastor Williams and left the church clutching the fake vows, my hands shaking with a combination of rage and fear. This wasn't just wedding planning interference anymore. This was an attempt to fundamentally alter the nature of my marriage, to trap me into promises I'd never agreed to make, to use my own wedding ceremony to establish a power dynamic that would define the rest of my life. The drive home passed in a blur. I kept thinking about the scope of Linda's deception, about how carefully she'd orchestrated these attempts to override my choices while keeping me unaware of what was happening. But even more disturbing was the growing certainty that she couldn't have done all of this without David's knowledge or cooperation. The vendors had mentioned speaking to, quote, "your mother-in-law," but also references to authorization that would need to come from David. The menu changes required financial approval that would have shown up on credit card statements David would have seen. The vow situation was so serious, so potentially life-altering, that it was impossible to believe Linda would have attempted it without discussing it with her son first. Which meant David knew. David knew about the florist's calls and the menu changes and the ceremony manipulation, and he'd chosen not to tell me. He'd been complicit in his mother's deception, allowing her to work behind the scenes to reshape our wedding, while he continued to have gentle, reasonable conversations with me about compromise and family harmony. I was still sitting in my car in the driveway of our house on Maple Street, staring at dress. The fake vows. When my phone rang, David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I needed to know how deep his involvement went, needed to give him a chance to explain before I made any irreversible decisions. "Hey, babe," he said cheerfully. "How was school today? I was thinking we could grab dinner at Romano's tonight and go over some final wedding details." Final wedding details. The casual normalcy of his tone, as if we were having ordinary pre-wedding conversations instead of dealing with his mother's systematic attempts to deceive me, made my anger flare even hotter. "Which final details?" I asked carefully. "Oh, just making sure everything's coordinated." My mom mentioned she'd been in touch with some of the vendors to double-check a few things, and I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. There it was. Not quite an admission, but close enough. David knew about Linda's vendor contacts, knew she'd been double-checking things, and he was framing it as helpful coordination rather than unauthorized interference. What kind of things was she double-checking? Just logistics stuff. She has experience with these events, and she wanted to make sure we hadn't missed anything important. The lie was so smooth, so casually delivered, that it took my breath away. He was going to pretend that Linda's deception had been helpful event coordination, that her attempts to override my choices had been motivated by experience and good intentions. David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. His tone became more cautious. Of course. What's going on? Did you know your mother called our florist pretending to be me and trying to change our flower order? The silence that followed was answer enough, but when David finally spoke, his response was even worse than I'd expected. Jess, that's not exactly what happened. Mom was trying to help clarify some details that she thought might have gotten confused. She wasn't trying to deceive anyone. She impersonated me, David. She called, claiming to be me, and tried to make changes to our order without our authorization. She was trying to prevent a potential problem, he said, his voice getting defensive. The wildflowers you picked aren't going to photograph well, and they might not hold up in the heat. She was thinking about the practical aspects. Without telling me. Without asking me. She was making decisions about my wedding flowers behind my back. She was making suggestions about our wedding flowers based on her experience with these events. Our wedding flowers. David was already reframing the situation, making Linda's deception sound reasonable and my anger sound overblown. I thought about the menu changes, the vow situation, all the other vendor contacts I'd discovered, and realized this conversation wasn't going to lead to the honesty and accountability I needed. What about the catering changes, the $800 in menu upgrades she tried to add without telling me? Another pause. She mentioned that to me. She thought the original menu was a little basic for the venue and the guest list we have. And you didn't think to discuss that with me before authorizing it? I didn't authorize anything yet. I wanted to talk to you first. But he hadn't talked to me first. It had been over a week since Linda contacted the caterer, according to Martha, and David had never mentioned the conversation or the suggested changes. He'd been planning to present it to me as a fait accompli, just like everything else. David, your mother brought fake vows to Pastor Williams. She told him we'd decided to use traditional vows instead of writing our own. The silence stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice was strained. She mentioned that she'd talked to Pastor Williams about ceremony options. She brought him vows, David. Specific vows that she'd written for us, including promises that I would never agree to make. She tried to arrange for me to speak words at our wedding that I've never seen and don't support. I'm sure she was just trying to help. Sometimes personal vows can be awkward or inappropriate, and she wanted to make sure we had good alternatives. The word inappropriate hit me like a physical blow. My personal vows, the promises I wanted to make to the man I loved, were potentially inappropriate in David's mind. But Linda's version, with its emphasis on obedience and submission, was apparently more suitable. Have you seen these vows? I asked. Mom showed me some traditional options, yes. And they're beautiful, Jessica. They're classic and meaningful and appropriate for a formal wedding ceremony. He'd seen them. He'd seen the vows that would have me promising to obey him and defer to his judgment, and he thought they were beautiful and appropriate. Not just acceptable as an alternative, but actually preferable to anything I might write myself. I'm coming over, I said, ending the call before he could respond. The drive to David's apartment gave me just enough time to process the full scope of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about wedding planning disagreements or family pressure. This was about a systematic effort to deceive me, to manipulate me into a wedding and a marriage that served the Thompson family's interests rather than my own. Linda had been working behind the scenes for weeks, possibly months, to override every choice that didn't meet her standards. And David had not only known about it, He'd been actively complicit, authorizing some changes and failing to warn me about others. Most devastatingly, he'd seen the manipulative vows his mother had prepared and thought they were not just acceptable but actually superior to anything I might write. He wanted me to promise obedience and submission at our wedding, wanted our marriage to be built on the kind of traditional power dynamic that would ensure the Thompson family maintained control over our relationship. David was waiting for me when I arrived at his apartment, clearly having used the drive time to prepare his arguments. He greeted me at the door with flowers, grocery store roses that felt like an insult after everything I'd discovered. "Jessica, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my mom's involvement in the wedding planning," he said before I'd even sat down. "Show me the vows," I said. "What?" "Show me the vows your mother wrote for us. The ones you think are beautiful and appropriate." David hesitated, and I could see him calculating whether it was better to produce them or try to deflect the conversation in a different direction. "I don't have them here," he said finally. "Then call your mother and get them." "Jessica, I think you're getting worked up over something that isn't as big a deal as you're making it. My mom was just trying to help ensure that our ceremony is meaningful and appropriate." "Appropriate for who?" "For everyone. For our families, for our guests, for the kind of marriage we want to build together." "What kind of marriage is that, David?" He looked genuinely confused by the question, as if the answer was so obvious it shouldn't need to be stated. "A strong marriage. A stable marriage. The kind of marriage our parents have built, where everyone knows their role and works together toward common goals." "What's my role? What do you mean?" "In this strong, stable marriage, where everyone knows their role. What's my role?" David's expression became cautious, as if he sensed that this was a trap but couldn't figure out how to avoid it. "You're my wife," he said carefully. "You're my partner in building a life together." "Equal partner?" "Of course. Then why do the vows your mother wrote have me promising to obey you?" "That's just traditional language, Jessica. It doesn't mean anything literal in a modern marriage." "Then why include it?" "Because it's part of the ceremony tradition. Because it connects us to generations of marriages that have worked. Marriages where wives promise to obey their husbands. Marriages where both partners understood their responsibilities and worked together toward shared goals. With the husband making the decisions and the wife supporting them." David ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned. "You're twisting everything around," he said. "This isn't about one person controlling the other. It's about having clear roles and expectations, so there's no confusion about how decisions get made. And who makes the decisions in our marriage? We make them together. But if we disagree..." The pause before his answer told me everything I needed to know. "If we disagree, we work it out. We compromise. We find solutions that work for both of us. Like we've been doing with the wedding planning?" "Yes, exactly like that. David, I haven't gotten my way on a single significant wedding decision. The venue, the flowers, the music, the menu, the wedding party. Every time we've had different preferences, yours has been the one we've gone with." "That's not true. We've compromised on lots of things." "Name one." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. I could see him mentally reviewing the past months of wedding planning, trying to identify a single instance where my preferences had prevailed over his family's wishes. "The cake," he said finally. "We're having the cake flavor you wanted. Carrot cake with cream cheese frosting. The most basic, least controversial choice possible. That's your example of compromise?" "You're being unfair, Jessica. This whole wedding has been about what you want. This whole wedding has been about what your mother wants," I corrected. "And apparently what you want is for me to promise to obey you at our ceremony, and then spend our marriage deferring to your judgment whenever we disagree." "That's not what I want," David said, but his denial lacked conviction. "Then get rid of the fake vows. Call your mother right now and tell her that we're writing our own vows and that her interference in our wedding planning stops immediately." David stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. This was his moment to choose, to decide whether he was going to stand with me against his family's manipulation, or continue to enable their control over our relationship. "I think you're overreacting," he said finally. "My mom isn't trying to control anything. She's trying to help us avoid potential problems and ensure that our wedding reflects well on both our families. Call her now, David. Tell her to stop interfering with our vendors and our ceremony." Or what? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that David was calling my bluff, testing whether I was serious about drawing boundaries or whether I could be pressured into backing down like I had so many times before. "Or I'm done," I said quietly. "You don't mean that. Try me." David stared at me for several seconds, clearly expecting me to soften the ultimatum or offer some kind of compromise. When I didn't, his expression began to shift from confusion to something harder, more calculating. "Jessica, we're 3 weeks away from our wedding. Our families have made plans, we've spent money. People have arranged their schedules around this date. You can't seriously be threatening to call everything off over wedding planning disagreements. This isn't about wedding planning, David. This is about respect. This is about honesty. This is about whether you see me as an equal partner in this marriage, or as someone whose opinions and preferences matter less than your family's expectations. Of course I see you as an equal partner. Then prove it. Call your mother and tell her to stop." David pulled out his phone, and for a moment I thought he was actually going to do it. Instead, he showed me the screen, where Linda's number was displayed but not dialed. "If I make this call," he said slowly, "if I tell my mother to back off and let us handle our own wedding planning, what's going to happen the next time you and my family disagree about something? Are you going to threaten to leave me every time you don't get your way?" The question revealed so much about how David saw our relationship, about his assumption that my standing up for myself was equivalent to demanding to always get my way. He couldn't conceive of a middle ground where my opinions were respected and considered, where compromises actually flowed in both directions. "I don't want to get my way about everything," I said. "I want to be included in decisions that affect me. I want my preferences to matter as much as your mother's. I want honesty instead of deception. My mother hasn't been deceiving you, she's been trying to help. She impersonated me to vendors, David. She tried to arrange for me to speak vows at our wedding that I've never seen. If that's not deception, what is? She's been trying to prevent problems before they happen. She has experience with these events that we don't have. Then why didn't she talk to me directly about her concerns instead of going behind my back?" David didn't have an answer for that, or at least not one he was willing to share. We stood there in his living room, the grocery store roses wilting on the coffee table between us, and I could feel the foundation of our relationship cracking under the weight of everything that had been revealed. "Make the call, David," I said one more time. He looked at the phone in his hand, then at me, then back at the phone. For a moment I thought he might actually choose me, might find the courage to stand up to his family's expectations for the sake of our relationship. Instead, he turned off the phone and set it down on the coffee table. "I can't do this right now," he said. "You're upset, you're not thinking clearly. Why don't you go home and get some rest? And we can talk about this tomorrow when you've had time to calm down." Calm down. As if my anger about being deceived and manipulated was simply a case of female hysteria that would resolve itself with a good night's sleep. As if the discovery that my fiancé had been complicit in his mother's attempts to control our wedding and our marriage was something I just needed to get over. "I am thinking clearly," I said, picking up my purse. "Maybe for the first time in months." I left David's apartment that night knowing that our relationship had fundamentally changed. Not because of the wedding planning conflicts or even because of Linda's interference, but because of David's response to being confronted with the truth about what had been happening. He'd chosen to defend and minimize his mother's deception, rather than acknowledge the harm it had caused. He'd chosen family loyalty over honesty, control over partnership, his mother's approval over my feelings and autonomy. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept thinking about the fake vows, about the promises Linda had written for me to make, about David's assertion that they were beautiful and appropriate. I thought about the systematic way every aspect of our wedding had been gradually shifted away from my preferences and toward the Thompson family's vision. I thought about the months of gentle manipulation, the gradual erosion of my voice in my own life. But mostly, I thought about the conversation I'd just had with David, about his refusal to make a simple phone call that would have demonstrated his commitment to honesty and partnership in our relationship. That phone call would have been the easiest thing in the world if he'd genuinely wanted to protect our relationship from his family's interference. The fact that he couldn't make it told me everything I needed to know about what our marriage would look like. Mom was waiting for me when I got home, still in her scrubs from the hospital, but clearly having stayed up to make sure I was okay. She took one look at my face and enveloped me in the kind of hug that only mothers can provide, the kind that makes you feel like you're 8 years old again, and that someone else can handle the grown-up problems for a while. "What happened, sweetheart?" she asked when I'd finally stopped crying long enough to speak. I told her everything, about the vendor calls and the menu changes and the fake vows. About David's knowledge and complicity, about his refusal to confront his mother's behavior, about the realization that our entire wedding had been systematically manipulated without my awareness. Mom listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail I shared. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, just holding my hands and thinking. "You know what you have to do," she said finally. "Do I?" "Yes, baby, you do. The question is whether you're brave enough to do it." I looked around our little kitchen, at the familiar furniture, and the photos on the refrigerator, and the comfortable chaos of a home where people were allowed to be themselves, without constantly performing for someone else's approval. I thought about the house David and I had bought together, with its neutral colors and formal furniture, and careful decorations that reflected the Thompson family's taste rather than our own. What if I'm making a mistake, I asked. What if I'm throwing away something good because I'm too stubborn to compromise? "Jessica Marie," Mom said, using my full name the way she had when I was a child and needed to pay attention to something important. "Compromise is when both people give up something to find a solution that works for everyone. What you've been doing isn't compromise, it's surrender." "But I love him." "I know you do. But love isn't enough if it's not built on respect and honesty. And honey, if a man can't stand up for you before you're married, when you're supposedly at your most important to him, what makes you think he'll stand up for you after?" The question hit me like a physical blow, because I'd been asking myself the same thing since leaving David's apartment. If he couldn't choose me over his mother's approval when it came to something as basic as wedding planning honesty, how could I trust him to choose me when we faced the real challenges that marriage would bring? "I'm scared," I admitted. "Of course you are. Making the right choice doesn't stop being scary just because it's right." "What if I regret it?" Mom smiled sadly. "What if you regret not making it?" We sat together in the kitchen until almost midnight, drinking tea and talking about courage and self-respect and the difference between being alone and being lonely. When I finally went to bed that night, I knew what I had to do. I'd known since the moment David refused to make that phone call, maybe even since I'd discovered the scope of his family's deception. The only question was whether I'd have the courage to follow through when morning came and the full reality of what I was about to lose became clear. Because calling off a wedding 3 weeks before the date wasn't just about ending a relationship. It was about disappointing families, losing deposits, facing the judgment of an entire community that would want to know why I'd walked away from what looked like a perfect match. But as I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the fake vows Linda had prepared for me, I realized that the community's judgment was the least of my concerns. The real question was whether I could live with myself if I went through with a wedding that had been built on deception and manipulation, if I made promises at an altar that I'd been systematically excluded from planning. The answer, when it came, was surprisingly clear. I couldn't, I wouldn't. And that meant I had some very difficult phone calls to make in the morning. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that makes even the air feel heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was weighted down with the tension that had been building for weeks. I stood in the bridal suite at the Millfield Country Club, staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror while the hairstylist worked around me, and tried to reconcile the woman looking back at me with the person I'd been just 3 weeks ago. I'd made a decision in those final weeks, but not the one Mom had expected, or that my heart had been screaming for me to make. I hadn't called off the wedding. Instead, I'd chosen to go through with it, but on my own terms, with my own boundaries firmly in place. It was perhaps the most terrifying compromise I'd ever made with myself, a gamble that David would choose me when faced with an ultimatum in front of 200 guests, rather than continue enabling his mother's control. The dress still fit perfectly, though I'd lost weight from the stress of the past month. The alteration seamstress had been concerned about how thin I'd gotten, but Linda had been delighted, commenting that I looked more elegant than ever. The irony wasn't lost on me that my emotional distress had produced exactly the kind of refined appearance the Thompson family valued. Mandy sat in the corner of the bridal suite, already dressed in her lavender maid of honor gown, watching me with the careful attention of someone monitoring a patient who might need immediate intervention. She'd been my rock through everything, never once suggesting that I should call off the wedding but making it clear that she'd support whatever decision I made. When I'd told her about my plan to force the issue during the ceremony itself, she'd gone pale but nodded grimly. "Are you sure about this?" she'd asked. "Because once you draw that line in front of everyone, there's no taking it back." "I know," I'd replied. "But David needs to choose in public where everyone can see what kind of man he really is. And I need to know, definitively, whether he's capable of standing up to his family when it matters." Mom was bustling around the suite, ostensibly helping with final preparations but actually serving as my emotional support system. She'd taken the day off from the hospital, something she rarely did, because she knew I was going to need her. Every few minutes, she'd catch my eye in the mirror and give me a small nod of encouragement, reminding me without words that I had her full support no matter what happened. Linda hadn't been by the bridal suite yet, which was unusual given her tendency to involve herself in every aspect of wedding preparations. Part of me wondered if David had finally had a conversation with her about boundaries, but the more realistic part suspected she was simply busy orchestrating last-minute details without bothering to consult me. At 11:30, exactly 90 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, Linda swept into the bridal suite like a general inspecting troops before battle. She was resplendent in navy blue silk, with jewelry that probably cost more than my annual salary, and she carried herself with the absolute confidence of someone who knew everything was proceeding according to her plans. "Jessica, darling, you look absolutely stunning," she said, though her eyes were already scanning the room for details that might need her attention. "The photographer is ready for family portraits, and the florist just finished with the ceremony arrangements. Everything is proceeding beautifully." She paused, her gaze landing on Mandy with an expression that was politely neutral but somehow conveyed disapproval. "Amanda, how lovely you look in lavender. Though I do hope you remember our conversation about appropriate behavior during formal ceremonies." The comment was delivered with Linda's trademark smile, but the message was clear. Mandy was being reminded of her place, warned to behave appropriately according to Thompson family standards, treated like a potential problem that needed managing rather than my beloved sister and closest friend. "I'm sure Amanda will be perfect," Mom said firmly, moving to stand beside Mandy in a gesture of quiet solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Linda's smile became slightly strained. "Of course. I simply want everything to be flawless for Jessica's special day." "Our special day," I corrected quietly. "This is David's wedding too." "Naturally," Linda said, though something in her tone suggested she viewed David's role as somewhat secondary to the broader family event she'd orchestrated. "David is downstairs with his groomsmen, looking very handsome. He's so excited to make you his wife." The possessive language made my skin crawl. Make me his wife, as if I was something to be claimed rather than someone choosing to enter into a partnership. But I simply nodded and tried to look appropriately bridal, while my stomach churned with anticipation of what was coming. "Now," Linda continued, pulling out her ever-present notebook, "I've made a few small adjustments to the processional order that I think will improve the overall flow of the ceremony." My hands stilled in my lap. "What kind of adjustments?" "Nothing major," Linda assured me, though her carefully casual tone suggested otherwise. "I've simply rearranged things so that Rachel will escort David down the aisle, and Amanda can follow with the other bridesmaids. It creates better visual symmetry and ensures that the family representation is properly balanced." The room went completely silent. This was it, the moment I'd been preparing for. The final attempt to remove Mandy from her rightful place beside me. Linda had waited until the morning of the wedding, until it would be maximum chaos to resist, to make her move. "That's not happening," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Linda's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. "I'm sorry, dear. Mandy is my maid of honor. She walks down the aisle last, before me, just as we planned." "That's not changing. Jessica, I understand your attachment to Amanda, but we've discussed this extensively. Rachel's participation as David's escort creates a more appropriate balance for the ceremony." "We haven't discussed anything," I said, standing up despite the hairstylist's protests. "You've made demands and expected compliance, but this is my wedding, and Mandy is my maid of honor." For the first time since I'd known her, Linda looked genuinely taken aback. She'd clearly expected me to fold under pressure, to give in, rather than cause a scene on my wedding day. The fact that I was standing up to her in front of witnesses seemed to genuinely shock her. "I think you're being quite unreasonable," she said, her polished composure beginning to crack. "This is a family celebration, and family harmony should take precedence over individual preferences." "My sister is my family too," I replied. "And she's going to be my maid of honor today, whether you approve or not." Linda's expression hardened. "I see. Well, I suppose we'll have to discuss this with David and see what he thinks about disrupting carefully laid plans for the sake of stubbornness." The threat was unmistakable. She was going to involve David, expecting him to pressure me into compliance the way he had so many times before. This was exactly what I'd been hoping for, the opportunity to force him to choose sides in front of everyone. But my heart was still pounding as Linda swept out of the bridal suite to find her son. "Well," Mandy said into the silence that followed, "that went about as well as expected." Mom was staring at the door Linda had exited through, her expression thoughtful. "She's not used to being told no," she observed, "especially not by someone she sees as subordinate to her authority." "What do you think she'll do?" I asked. "Whatever she thinks will work," Mom replied grimly. "But honey, you've started something that can't be stopped now. You need to be prepared for David to choose his mother over you." I nodded, though the thought made me feel physically sick. Everything I'd been building toward, everything I'd been hoping for, depended on David finding the courage to stand up to his family when confronted with a clear choice. If he chose them, if he prioritized their expectations over my feelings and autonomy, then I'd have my answer about what our marriage would look like. 20 minutes later, David appeared in the doorway of the bridal suite, looking handsome in his black tuxedo, but clearly agitated. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested he was under considerable stress. "Jessica, can I talk to you privately for a minute?" he asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. "Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of my family," I replied, gesturing to Mom and Mandy. David's jaw tightened slightly. "This is about our wedding, about decisions that affect both of us. I think we should discuss it alone." "The decision about who serves as my maid of honor affects me," I said firmly. "And I've already made it. Mandy is my maid of honor, just as we originally planned." "Jessica, be reasonable. My mother has put a lot of work into making this day perfect, and asking her to accommodate last-minute changes isn't fair to her or to the other people involved in the ceremony." Last-minute changes. David was framing my insistence on keeping my sister as my maid of honor as a last-minute change, as if Linda's attempts to replace her were the original plan rather than unauthorized interference. "There are no last-minute changes," I said clearly. "Mandy has always been my maid of honor. Your mother's suggestions don't alter that." "My mother's suggestions are based on experience and good judgment," David replied, his voice getting sharper. "She understands the logistics and protocol involved in formal ceremonies better than we do." "Protocol," I repeated. "Is that what this is about? Making sure we follow proper protocol?" "It's about making sure everything goes smoothly and appropriately. It's about respecting the effort that's gone into planning this event and the people who will be attending it." David was doing exactly what I'd expected, prioritizing appearances and social expectations over my feelings and preferences. But hearing him do it, seeing him choose his mother's version of appropriateness over my clearly stated wishes, still felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than I'd anticipated. "What about respecting me?" I asked. "What about respecting my relationship with my sister?" "Of course I respect your relationship with Amanda," David said, though his tone suggested he considered the question unfair. "But this isn't about your relationship with her. This is about making smart choices for our wedding ceremony. Smart according to who? Smart according to people who understand these situations, Jessica. Smart according to my mother, who has experience with formal events and social expectations that we don't have. There it was, the fundamental assumption that had been underlying all of our wedding planning conflicts. Linda's opinion mattered more than mine because she had experience and social standing that I lacked. My preferences were naive and uninformed, while hers were sophisticated and appropriate. I see, I said quietly. So your mother's experience trumps my feelings about my own wedding. It's not about trumping anything, David said, clearly frustrated that I wasn't accepting his reasoning. It's about making decisions based on more than just emotions. It's about thinking practically about what works best for everyone involved. What works best for everyone, or what works best for your family? David's expression shifted, and for a moment I saw something that looked almost like panic cross his features. Jessica, we're an hour away from our ceremony. This isn't the time for dramatic confrontations about wedding party logistics. Dramatic confrontations. David was dismissing my stand for my sister's role as dramatic, as if my refusal to be manipulated was somehow unreasonable behavior that reflected poorly on me rather than on the people trying to manipulate me. Then make it simple, I said. Tell your mother that Mandy is my maid of honor and that's final. I can't do that. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something break inside my chest. David couldn't stand up to his mother for me. Even on our wedding day, even when faced with a direct choice between her demands and my clearly stated wishes, he couldn't choose me. You can't, I repeated slowly, or you won't. Jessica, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We can work this out, we can find a compromise that makes everyone happy. What compromise? What middle ground is there between my sister being my maid of honor and your sister replacing her? David ran a hand through his hair again, clearly searching for some solution that would allow him to avoid choosing sides. Maybe they could both have special roles. Maybe we could adjust the ceremony to include both of them prominently. David, listen to me very carefully, I said, standing up and facing him directly. I am not negotiating about this. Mandy is my maid of honor. That's not changing, regardless of what your mother wants or what compromises you think might work. The only question is whether you're going to support me or continue to prioritize your mother's preferences over mine. You're putting me in an impossible position, David said, his voice rising slightly. No, I'm putting you in a very simple position. You can choose to support your wife on her wedding day, or you can choose to support your mother's attempts to control our ceremony. Those are your options. Jessica, you're being unreasonable. Am I? Is wanting my sister beside me on my wedding day unreasonable? Is expecting my fiancé to support my clearly stated wishes unreasonable? It's unreasonable to wait until the morning of our wedding to start making demands that disrupt carefully laid plans. I'm not making demands, David. I'm maintaining boundaries that should never have been challenged in the first place. We stared at each other across the bridal suite, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Part of him seemed to understand that I was right, that Linda's interference had been inappropriate, and that he should be supporting me. But a larger part of him was clearly terrified of confronting his mother's displeasure, of disrupting the family dynamics he'd grown up with. Fine, he said finally, but his tone suggested it was anything but fine. I'll talk to my mother about keeping the original plan. No, I said firmly. You'll tell your mother that Mandy is my maid of honor, and that her suggestions about changing that are inappropriate and unwelcome. David's expression darkened. I'll handle the conversation with my mother however I think is best. Then handle it, I said. Because if Mandy isn't standing beside me when I walk down that aisle, I won't be walking down it at all. The ultimatum was out there now, clear and unmistakable. David stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked like genuine anger mixed with disbelief that I would dare to threaten the wedding over what he clearly still saw as a minor issue. You wouldn't, he said. Try me. David stood there for another long moment, clearly calculating whether I was serious or whether this was a bluff he could call. When he finally turned and left the bridal suite without another word, I knew that whatever conversation he was about to have with his mother would determine the future of our relationship. The 45 minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I tried to focus on final preparations, on makeup touch-ups and last-minute adjustments to my dress. but my mind was completely consumed with what was happening between David and Linda somewhere else in the country club. Mandy sat quietly beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand, while Mom maintained a steady stream of calm, practical conversation that helped keep me grounded. When David finally returned, his expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his posture that suggested the conversation with his mother hadn't gone well. He was accompanied by Rachel, who looked elegant in her blue bridesmaid dress, but also somewhat uncomfortable, as if she'd been reluctantly drawn into a family conflict she'd preferred to avoid. "We've worked out a solution," David announced, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely happy with whatever had been decided. "Which is?" I asked. "Rachel will escort me down the aisle as planned, but Amanda will retain her position as your maid of honor. My mother agrees that maintaining family harmony is more important than protocol adjustments." The phrasing was careful, designed to make it sound like a reasonable compromise rather than Linda backing down from an inappropriate demand. But the important thing was that Mandy would be my maid of honor, that I'd stood my ground and won this particular battle. "Thank you," I said, though I was watching David's face carefully for any sign of how he really felt about the outcome. "However," David continued, and my stomach clenched at the qualifier, "I hope you understand that my mother has put considerable effort into making this day special for both of us, and public confrontations about wedding logistics aren't fair to her or to our families." Even in conceding the immediate point, David was making it clear that he viewed my stand as unfair to Linda, as some kind of unreasonable behavior that had forced him to have difficult conversations with his mother. I was being blamed for the conflict, not praised for standing up for my sister, or thanked for maintaining appropriate boundaries. "I understand," I said quietly, though what I understood was that David still fundamentally didn't grasp why his mother's behavior had been inappropriate, or why I'd been justified in refusing to accept it. The remainder of the pre-ceremony preparation passed in a tense calm. The photographer arrived to take family portraits, and Linda appeared with a brilliant smile and perfect composure, as if the morning's conflict had never happened. She posed graciously with our families, complimented my appearance, and made appropriate conversation about the beauty of the day and the significance of the occasion. But there was something in her eyes when she looked at me, a cold assessment that hadn't been there before. I'd challenged her authority and won, at least temporarily, and she was reevaluating me as an opponent, rather than someone who could be easily managed through charm and social pressure. As the ceremony time approached, the bridal party gathered for final instructions and last-minute adjustments. Mandy stood beside me in her lavender dress, looking beautiful and composed despite the morning's drama, and I felt a surge of gratitude that she was here, that I'd fought for her presence and won. "You ready for this?" she whispered as we prepared to make our way to the ceremony space. "As ready as I'll ever be," I whispered back, though I wasn't sure what exactly I was ready for. The ceremony itself, yes, but also whatever came after, whatever our marriage would look like now that David and I had established these particular battle lines. The ceremony space was everything Linda had envisioned, and more. The country club's event room had been transformed with white roses and elegant drapery, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over perfectly arranged seating for 200 guests. It was beautiful, undeniably so, though it bore little resemblance to the more intimate, personal celebration I'd originally imagined. As the processional music began and the bridesmaids started their walk down the aisle, I caught sight of David standing at the altar with Pastor Williams. He looked handsome and composed, every inch the successful young man his family had raised him to be, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was still tense from the morning's confrontations. Rachel walked down the aisle with graceful elegance, taking her place beside the groomsmen with the kind of poise that Linda valued so highly. Then it was Mandy's turn, and my heart swelled with pride as my sister walked down the aisle with quiet dignity, taking her rightful place as my maid of honor. But as I prepared to begin my own walk down the aisle, arm in arm with my uncle who'd agreed to escort me, I noticed commotion near the back of the ceremony space. Linda was speaking intensely to someone just outside the main doors, her usually perfect composure showing cracks of agitation. The music shifted to the bridal processional, and I began my walk down the aisle, trying to focus on David's face rather than whatever drama was unfolding behind me. But as I reached the halfway point, Linda suddenly appeared beside the center aisle, moving to intercept me with an urgency that made several guests turn to stare. "Jessica," she said in a voice that was carefully controlled but clearly strained, "there's been a small issue with the ceremony order that needs immediate attention." I stopped walking, my uncle's arm tightening protectively around mine as Linda moved closer. The music continued playing, but I could feel the attention of 200 guests focused on us, could sense that something was happening that was outside the normal flow of wedding ceremony protocol. "What issue?" I asked, though my heart was already racing with the certainty that this was another attempt to control the ceremony at the last possible moment. "The officiant has some concerns about the processional order," Linda said, her voice pitched to carry to nearby guests while still maintaining an appearance of calm discussion. "He feels that having both Rachel and Amanda in prominent roles might be confusing for the ceremony photography and videography." It was a lie, obviously and transparently a lie, because I'd spoken with Pastor Williams myself about the ceremony order, and he'd expressed no concerns about anything. But Linda was making this play in front of 200 guests, calculating that I wouldn't be willing to call her out publicly and create a scene at my own wedding. "The ceremony order is fine," I said firmly, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear clearly. "Mandy is my maid of honor, and that's not changing." "Jessica, please be reasonable," Linda said, moving even closer and reaching out as if to take my arm. "These are minor adjustments that will improve the overall ceremony experience for everyone." Before Linda could touch me, David suddenly appeared beside us, having apparently left his position at the altar when he saw what was happening. His face was flushed with what looked like embarrassment and anger, though I couldn't tell which of us was the target of those emotions. "Mom, we discussed this," he said in a low voice that was clearly intended to end the conversation quickly and quietly. "David, the officiant specifically requested these adjustments," Linda insisted, maintaining her fiction even though Pastor Williams was clearly visible at the altar, looking confused by the delay but showing no signs of having made any requests about ceremony order. "The officiant requested nothing," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the silent ceremony space. "This is another attempt to remove my sister from her role as my maid of honor, and it's not happening." A murmur went through the assembled guests as they began to understand that they were witnessing a family conflict rather than a minor logistical adjustment. David's face went pale as he realized that his mother's latest attempt at control was playing out in front of everyone we knew. "Jessica, please," he said, reaching for my hand. "Let's handle this quietly." "I am handling this quietly," I replied. "I'm stating clearly that my sister is my maid of honor and walking down this aisle to marry you. Your mother is the one creating a scene." David's expression shifted, and I saw the moment when he made his choice. Instead of standing with me, instead of publicly supporting my clearly stated boundary, he turned to Linda with a pleading expression. "Mom, please. Not here, not now." The weakness in his voice, the way he was begging his mother to stop rather than firmly telling her to stop, revealed everything I needed to know about what our marriage would look like. David would never stand up to his family for me. Even here, even now, when their behavior was disrupting our own wedding ceremony, he couldn't find the strength to choose me. "I think we need to discuss this as a family," Linda said, clearly sensing that David was still wavering and that she might be able to pressure him into compliance if she could get us away from the public scrutiny of our guests. "We're not discussing anything," I said firmly. "Mandy is my maid of honor. That's final." Linda's composed facade finally cracked completely. "Young lady, you are being incredibly selfish and disrespectful. This is a family celebration, and your behavior is ruining it for everyone." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I could feel the attention of 200 guests focused on how I would respond. Linda was counting on my instinct to avoid conflict, to apologize and back down rather than continue to resist in such a public forum. Instead, I looked directly at David. "Are you going to let your mother speak to me that way?" David's face went through a series of expressions, and I could see him struggling with the choice he was being forced to make. Stand up to his mother and support his bride, or continue to enable her behavior and hope I would eventually give in. "Jessica, my mother didn't mean it that way," he said finally. "She's just stressed about everything going perfectly." It wasn't support, it wasn't protection. It was another excuse, another rationalization for behavior that should have been unacceptable to him. David was choosing his mother's feelings over mine, even here, even now, in front of everyone we knew. Actually, I meant it exactly that way, Linda said, apparently deciding that subtlety was no longer necessary. Jessica is being selfish and stubborn, and someone needs to tell her so. That's when David reached for my arm. Not gently, not romantically, but with a firm grip that was clearly intended to physically move me away from the confrontation and into compliance with his family's demands. "We're going to step aside and handle this privately," he said, his fingers digging into my arm through the delicate fabric of my wedding dress. The pain was sharp and immediate, but what shocked me more was the realization that my fiancé was physically trying to force me to comply with his mother's demands. This wasn't gentle persuasion or even heated argument. This was physical coercion, an attempt to literally drag me away from my own wedding ceremony because I'd refused to surrender my sister's role to his family's preferences. "Let go of me," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of confused guests. "Jessica, don't make this worse than it already is," David said, his grip tightening rather than loosening. In that moment, with David's fingers digging into my arm and Linda watching with satisfaction as her son finally took physical action to enforce her will, I understood everything I needed to know about what my marriage would be like. This was my future. Being physically compelled to comply with Thompson family expectations, being blamed for any resistance I offered, being isolated from my own family when they conflicted with David's family's preferences. "I said let go of me," I repeated, louder this time, and when David's grip still didn't loosen, I pulled away from him hard enough that several guests gasped audibly. David stared at me with shock, and something that looked like genuine anger. "Jessica, you're making a scene." "I'm making a scene?" I looked around at the 200 guests who were watching this confrontation play out, at Pastor Williams standing uncomfortably at the altar, at my mother and sister looking horrified by what they were witnessing. "Your mother just tried to publicly override my choice of maid of honor, and you physically grabbed me when I refused to comply. Who exactly is making a scene here?" The question hung in the air, and I could see David realizing that our conflict was no longer private family drama. Everyone could see what was happening. Everyone could witness his choice to physically coerce me rather than support me, and everyone would remember this moment when they thought about our marriage in the future. "You're right," I said into the silence that followed. "Someone is making a scene. But it's not me." I turned to face our assembled guests, my voice carrying clearly across the ceremony space. "I'm sorry everyone came here expecting to see a wedding. But I can't marry someone who thinks it's acceptable to physically force me to comply with his family's demands." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible, but I felt nothing but relief as I spoke the words I should have said weeks ago. This wasn't the wedding I'd planned or the future I'd imagined, but it was the truth I'd been avoiding. I looked at David one more time, at the man I'd thought I loved, and saw nothing but confusion and anger in his expression. No recognition that his behavior had been inappropriate, no understanding of why I was refusing to accept it, no acknowledgement that he'd chosen his family's preferences over my basic autonomy. "Goodbye, David," I said quietly, then turned and walked back down the aisle I'd just traveled, my wedding dress trailing behind me as I left my own ceremony. The last thing I heard before the doors closed behind me was Linda's voice, high and strained, calling after me that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe I was, but as I stood in the country club parking lot, still in my wedding dress, with Mandy and Mom rushing out to stand beside me, I knew it wasn't the mistake Linda thought it was. The mistake would have been walking back down that aisle and promising to love, honor, and obey a man who thought my compliance was more important than my consent. The silence in the parking lot felt deafening after the chaos inside the country club. I stood there in my wedding dress, the Texas heat making the fabric cling uncomfortably to my skin, trying to process what had just happened. The weight of 200 pairs of eyes, the shock on David's face, the satisfaction in Linda's expression before it turned to fury. It all swirled together in my mind like a fever dream. Mandy reached me first, still in her lavender maid of honor dress, her face a mixture of pride and concern. She didn't say anything, just wrapped her arms around me and held tight while I tried to remember how to breathe normally. Mom appeared moments later, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the parking lot in her heels. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Mom asked, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she checked my face for signs of shock or distress. "I think so," I managed, surprised to find that it was true. Despite the chaos and humiliation, despite having just blown up my entire life in front of half the town, I felt lighter than I had in months. The constant tension I'd been carrying, the anxiety about pleasing everyone and managing David's family dynamics, had lifted the moment I walked away from that altar. "What do you need right now?" Mandy asked, ever practical even in crisis situations. "I need to get out of this dress," I said, looking down at the elaborate gown that had cost more than my monthly rent. "And I need to go home." The drive back to Maple Street passed in surreal quiet. None of us seemed to know what to say about what had just occurred, so we didn't say anything at all. I stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods of Millfield, at people going about their normal Saturday afternoon lives, and marveled at how completely my own normal life had just imploded. Back at the house, Mom helped me out of the wedding dress with gentle efficiency, treating me like I was recovering from surgery rather than a public emotional breakdown. When the dress was finally off and hanging in my childhood closet, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in hours. I changed into jeans and an old college t-shirt, clothes that felt like me in a way the designer gown never had, and went downstairs to find Mom and Mandy sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and serious expressions. "So," Mandy said when I joined them, "how are you feeling? Really feeling, not what you think you should be feeling." I considered the question seriously, taking inventory of my emotional state beyond the immediate adrenaline and shock. "Relieved," I said finally. "Sad about losing what I thought I had with David, but relieved that I don't have to keep pretending to be someone I'm not." Mom nodded approvingly. "Good. Because the person you were becoming in that relationship wasn't you. I was worried I was losing my daughter to someone else's vision of who she should be." Her words hit harder than I'd expected because they confirmed what I'd been afraid to acknowledge myself. I had been disappearing, gradually but steadily, under the pressure of trying to fit into David's family's expectations. Over the following days, I had to face the practical realities of calling off a wedding with 3 weeks' notice. Vendors needed to be contacted, deposits negotiated, explanations offered to confused relatives who'd traveled from out of state. The financial cost was significant but manageable, particularly compared to the emotional cost of going through with a marriage built on fundamentally unequal terms. David continued trying to contact me for weeks, his messages cycling through anger, confusion, and eventual resignation. He genuinely didn't seem to understand what had gone wrong, still believed my response had been disproportionate to the situation. His lack of understanding was perhaps the most telling confirmation that I'd made the right choice. When I finally responded, it was with a letter explaining everything I hadn't been able to say in that parking lot. I told him about respect and partnership, about the difference between compromise and surrender, about needing someone who would choose me over family pressure when it mattered most. I never received a response, which was probably for the best. Teaching became my anchor through the chaos of rebuilding my life. My third graders were blissfully oblivious to adult relationship drama, and standing in front of my classroom helping 8-year-olds discover the wonder of learning reminded me why I'd chosen this profession in the first place. Work felt like coming home to myself in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Sophie became a constant presence during those early weeks, dragging me to photography classes and hiking trips and art exhibitions. All the activities I'd gradually stopped doing, as my life had become more centered around David's preferences. Slowly, I began to remember what it felt like to make choices based on my own interests rather than other people's expectations. The photography class turned into a genuine passion that surprised me with its intensity. My instructor encouraged me to consider freelance work, and I started volunteering at the animal shelter, capturing images of dogs and cats that would help them find homes. It felt deeply satisfying to use my skills for something that made a genuine difference. Spring brought unexpected opportunities. I'd started writing about my experience, initially just for my own processing but eventually for publication. My first essay, titled "When Compromise Becomes Surrender," appeared in a women's magazine and prompted dozens of women to reach out with similar stories of gradually losing themselves in relationships that demanded constant accommodation. The response led to a regular column about boundaries and self-advocacy, work that felt deeply meaningful in ways I hadn't anticipated. If my painful experience could help other women recognize similar patterns in their own relationships, then something positive could come from all the confusion and heartbreak I'd endured. Mandy's wedding planning the following year was a refreshing contrast to my own experience. She made decisions based on what she and Marcus actually wanted, rather than what would impress their guests, and when Marcus's mother suggested changes, Mandy listened politely and then explained that they were happy with their original plans. "It's amazing how much simpler wedding planning is when you're not trying to please everyone," she told me one afternoon as we addressed invitations. "I just keep asking myself what Marcus and I actually want, and it turns out that's a pretty easy question to answer." As her maid of honor, I stood beside my sister as she and Marcus exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises that reflected their actual values rather than traditional language that sounded appropriate but felt empty. Watching them commit to a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine understanding, I felt both profound happiness for them and deep validation for my own choices. At the reception, I found myself in conversation with James, an old family friend who'd recently moved back to Millfield after finishing his medical residency. We'd known each other casually growing up, but he'd been a few years ahead of me in school. James was warm and funny and genuinely interested in my work as both a teacher and a writer. When he asked if I'd like to have coffee sometime, I found myself saying yes without the careful calculation that had characterized my previous dating attempts. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than the intense pressure that had characterized my relationship with David. James never made me feel like I needed to earn his approval or conform to his expectations. Instead, he seemed to appreciate the qualities that made me who I was, including the independence and self-advocacy that I'd fought so hard to reclaim. Unlike David, who'd seemed to define himself primarily in relation to his family's expectations, James had a strong sense of his own values and goals. He'd chosen to return to his hometown specifically because he wanted to serve a rural community where medical care was often hard to access. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in who I was rather than who I might become with the right guidance. When he met my family, the contrast with David's approach was immediately apparent. Where David had seemed to be evaluating my family for their social acceptability, James was clearly interested in understanding the people who'd shaped me. He asked thoughtful questions and listened with genuine attention. "I like him," Mom told me after James had joined us for Sunday dinner several times. "He seems to see you clearly, and he likes what he sees." The observation was simple but profound. James did see me clearly, both my strengths and my flaws, and he chose to be with me based on that accurate understanding rather than some idealized version he hoped I might become. As autumn approached, marking 2 years since my original wedding date, I found myself in a place I couldn't have imagined when I'd walked away from that altar. My career was thriving, my relationships with family and friends were stronger than ever, and my romantic relationship with James was developing into something deeper and more stable than I'd ever experienced. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my own judgment and prioritize my own well-being in ways that made me a better partner, sister, daughter, friend, and teacher. The woman who'd almost disappeared under the pressure of trying to become acceptable to the Thompson family had been replaced by someone who was comfortable with herself and confident in her choices. One evening, as James and I walked through downtown Millfield after dinner, he brought up the future in a way that felt both natural and significant. "I've been thinking about what I want my life to look like in 5 years, 10 years, he said, taking my hand as we walked past the familiar shops. "I see building a life with someone who shares my values and supports my goals while pursuing her own. Jessica, I see all of that with you if you want to see it with me." It wasn't a formal proposal, but it was a declaration of intention that felt more meaningful than any elaborate romantic gesture could have. James was offering me a partnership built on mutual respect and shared vision, the kind of relationship I'd been trying to build with David but had never quite achieved. "I want that too," I said, meaning it completely. "I want to build something real with you, something that makes both of us better, without requiring either of us to become someone we're not." 6 months later, James and I exchanged vows we'd written ourselves in front of 30 people we genuinely loved. There were no social obligations or family politics, no elaborate productions designed to impress people whose opinions didn't really matter. Just 2 people promising to build a life together based on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that makes both partners more themselves rather than less. As I spoke my vows to James, looking into the eyes of a man who'd never asked me to be anyone other than who I was, I thought about the woman who'd stood at a different altar years earlier, afraid to speak words that weren't her own. That woman had found the courage to walk away from a future that would have diminished her, and in doing so, she'd made space for this future that enhanced every part of who she was. The journey from that moment of crisis to this moment of joy hadn't been easy, but it had been mine. Every choice, every boundary, every moment of standing up for myself had led to this place where I could make promises I genuinely meant to a person who genuinely wanted to hear them. The story that had begun with manipulation and control had ended with choice and authenticity and the kind of love that makes everything else possible. It wasn't the ending I'd originally planned, but it was the ending I'd earned through the difficult work of learning to value myself enough to demand better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.